So good afternoon, good evening, Michael. Good evening, everyone joining us from the US. So this is basically the last episode of our series, First Projects Conversation, hosted and organized by the American Institute of Architects in Hong Kong. And my name is Su Chang, and I am a co-chair of the programs committee this year of BFA Hong Kong. For those who are joining us for the first time, First Project is a new initiative that we want to invite architects and designers to join us from different places around the world and to talk about how they begin and how that beginning led to where they are right now. So today we are excited to welcome Los Angeles-based architect Michael Maltzan, who is also a fellow of AIA and receiving the 2016 AIA Los Angeles Gold Medal. He is also a recipient of the American Academy of Arts and Letters Architecture Award and was elected to the National Academy of Design in 2020. I think we just chatted with Michael before this introduction for a little bit, and today we live in interesting times, and the challenge of social equity, political activism, public health, housing crisis, all these challenges are bigger than ever. And to me, when I saw Michael's work before I get to know Michael, I think when I first saw it, there's a kind of optimism that's channeled through his work done by him and the office. And you always have this sense of optimism, and then they always use a very simple tools, very basic to architecture, form, space, and materials to convey a sense of delight and amusement in response to all these very complex issues that we are facing today. And we are looking forward to hear more today in Michael's talk. And we will take the format of a conversation today. So after Michael's presentation, we will be joined by two former presidents of AIA Hong Kong, Anderson Lee, sitting next to me, and also Rex Wong will be joining us soon. Rex is also a member of RISD's Architecture Advisory Council, and Anderson is an associate professor at the University of Hong Kong. We would like to invite all our audience to submit questions or any topics you want us to discuss through the chat box or Q&A on Zoom, and we look forward to a conversation with Michael. Anytime you're ready, Michael.
Great.
Stop share screen and let you share.
I think it's. There we go. This works. Great. Chang and Anderson, thank you very much. And Rex, who I also serve on the advisory committee at RISD. It's terrific to see you as well. I appreciate being invited to talk with everybody today. It's evening here in Los Angeles, but nice to talk to you today. I think the concept of this lecture series, First Projects, is a striking one to me because, of course, for many architects, the idea of your first projects is an important one, is a significant one. Those projects really demonstrate and set the path in a lot of ways that your work takes. But for me, the first project that I thought about as a beginning practitioner, somebody starting an office, was the office itself, was the practice itself. I think in a lot of ways, that first project for an architect is often the idea of the office and how that begins to physically as well as intellectually manifest in the beginning. And I want to touch on that, at least in a portion of the talk tonight, especially around the influences that began to guide the office and some of the moments that were particularly important to me. any talk about my work, while we work internationally as a firm, any talk about my work in the start of the office and the practice really has to begin with Los Angeles. I continue to think of Los Angeles as one of the great urban laboratories of any city internationally. I've been fascinated, I continue to be fascinated by the texture and the grain, the culture of the city, and by the seemingly endless possibilities that exist here. The city's becoming more and more complex, like many cities. Certainly the last year and a half or 2 years have underlined many of the ongoing challenges that continue to face a city like Los Angeles. But I firmly believe that there is a significant role for architects and architectural practice in the face of that continuing urban evolution and the issues and challenges that face it. The city, when I first came here, which was in the late 1980s, was, but I think still is, an incredible juxtaposition of many cultures and many scales, many forms. It felt at the time like it was a place where individual approaches to architecture would be welcome, and I would argue even necessary. That was a fantastic attraction as a young architect, to be in a place where you felt that not only was there great possibility to find your voice, but that that voice was in fact welcome, and that it could potentially have an influence. That idea of invention in work has been a theme, a through line through much of Los Angeles architectural practice and the history of it, going all the way back to much of the early modernists, Frank Lloyd Wright's work here, the case study work, Rudolf Schindler, Gregory Ain, Richard Neutra. But it was a group of architects who were practicing, or maybe came to age in their practice in the 1970s and 1980s, who were of real importance to me. And those included people like Tom Main, Michael Rotundi, Eric Moss, Robert Mangurian, Frank Gehry, Fred Fisher. It was a group of architects who in many ways were blurring the traditional boundaries around how we defined architectural practice. Maybe even arguing that art practice was as important to and was as influential to architecture as traditional architectural histories. In any case, they were iconoclasts. They were, in a sense, outsiders who were making a type of work which I found completely fascinating. And in the face of a lot of the work that I was seeing at that time when I was in graduate school, undergraduate and graduate school, it was work that really seemed to capture a lot of the spirit of that particular moment, and much of the instability and questioning in architecture as it was evolving out of modernism to something else, whatever that was. That idea of the tradition of individual invention within architecture certainly comes with a great responsibility to try and find one's own way. And in the beginning, many of my first projects were a part of that attempt to find a voice that I felt was my own. But at the same time, the city was undergoing radical shocks all around me. In 1992, the city exploded in the Rodney King riots, the uprisings in the city, that really gave way the lie that the city was a was a multicultural city. It was clearly a city of many cultures, but those cultures were often siloized and apart. My idealized notion of LA that was represented by the spirit of a lot of that work that was influential for me, and the sense of possibility in the city really fell away to reveal a much starker, darker reality of segregation and inequality in the city. And there was no way, I felt, for architecture to ignore that reality. Many of us in the city, across all sorts of disciplines, but in architecture especially, started to try and find ways to be involved in changing that dynamic. I was looking for a way for architecture to be involved, and I thought that if you could begin to try to insert architecture into places in the city where it wasn't normally, most people would say it normally didn't occur, if you could break some of the boundaries around where architecture could exist in the city, that might help change the dynamic some. At least that was my thinking in the beginning. Out of those conversations, I was approached by a group called Inner City Arts. It's a nonprofit organization that teaches runs art programs. It teaches art to public school children, because a lot of the art programs, due to financial constraints, have been taken out of the public school district. And Inner City Arts was about to build a new campus which would really become the center of their programs. But even more importantly, their ambition was to make it a kind of community center for the children, their families, and this part of Los Angeles called the Skid Row district that was really undervalued and where very few resources ever found their way to a lot of the needs that existed there. They bought an existing building. It was an old auto body shop that we were going to renovate and add to, which we have. And we've continued to work with Inner City Arts over a number of years, not only building the original phase one, but building two other phases to the project, leading to a project which has become, in many ways, the whole end of a city block, and truly a kind of location for optimism in an area that, again, doesn't really have that many reasons to be optimistic. I think this photograph by Iwan Baan tells a great part of that story, that the building, which is that bright in a much more gray industrial landscape, and stands out in significant ways, acts as a kind of new anchor for this low-rise industrial district. But maybe even more importantly, and I think even telling about Los Angeles, is how proximate it is to the downtown urban core, the financial center of the city. And those kinds of juxtapositions and incredible proximities between great wealth and underprivilege, great juxtapositions even in terms of scale in the city, I think is an important fact to not only understand about the city, but has influenced a lot of my work. The first phase of the project was really renovating this auto body shop, and in similar ways to maybe using similar techniques to some of those early influential Los Angeles architects. I was trying to just reuse the kit of parts that we were given, to reuse the existing building, to clean it up, change the structure some, insert a series of rooms, almost like objects, in the space in a quite perfunctory way. The rawness of the space was important for me because it started to feel like, again, within that space, the architecture wasn't precious. It was present, it was considered, but it wasn't precious, and that meant that you could kind of make whatever in the building. This was a pro bono project. I was still working at the time in a firm. I was about to start my practice, but the project was a real success. And just as I was starting my firm, this project got published on the cover of Architectural Record, which was an extraordinary thing to happen in a very fortunate moment as I was trying to start my practice, because all of a sudden the work was more visible. I was anxious about that visibility so early, but I was more excited than anything else, as any young architect probably would be. Starting a practice, I was really on my own. In the beginning, it was me and one other person part-time. I had worked for a fairly large firm, one that was very influential, had a lot of work internationally, and because of that work, working at a firm like that, I had literally, it felt like, access to anything and anybody and any resources. It was a very stark reality the day I walked out of that office to start my own practice in the house that I was renting, where I was living, which is behind that hedge, and to realize that I had very few resources, almost none. I could try to call people, but very few people would pick up the phone. It was really a radical change to my situation, and frankly was unnerving and destabilizing, because in a sense, the way of doing work that I had romanticized didn't exist anymore. I had to find ways to try to make the work and make the office really from the very beginning. I was fortunate, though, again, coming back to the impact that inner city arts had, because a teacher at a private school called Harvard Westlake School in Los Angeles, who ran the art department for that school, knew about inner city arts. He had written his PhD thesis on the work that inner city arts was doing. And Harvard Westlake was about to build a new art campus, reusing some of the existing buildings on the campus, and also adding a bit to it. It had originally been an all-boys Episcopalian military school, and that's why the chapel was here. Much of my work was remaking the existing buildings, as I mentioned, but also then recladding the existing buildings, reproportioning them, adding a new gallery, which you see on the left. But also importantly, I was trying to find a new way of creating, through form and space, for myself, relationships to context, and to also make a kind of public or civic space. In a city like Los Angeles, which often gets described as a city that has no public forum, has no public space, has no place where you can actually gather and see each other. I was looking in this first project to try to make a space where the community of this school, at least, could gather to create a more almost traditional piazza, a plaza, for the school to gather, around which art classrooms were distributed. Also, I was trying to make with these forums a connection to some of the historic architecture on the campus. In this case, that mission style stucco building that the tower, the elevator tower, starts to create a series of relationships to. It was an early way of trying to extend not only some of my thinking about the need for public space, but to begin to try to understand how I might use sculpture, sculptural form to actually make space as opposed to form itself. Eventually, with the work, the office grew. This is almost looks like a satellite view of the office, but was a composite photograph that we took over a number of days of the plan of the office. In the beginning, I was able to just get one bay of this building, one column bay of this building. Eventually, we've taken over pretty much the entire building over the years. The office is very much a studio culture. I think that comes probably from my education, and Rex would understand this, of course, as well, at Rhode Island School of Design, where architecture is a specific discipline, but it's within the context of all of the other studio arts. Your friends are painters and sculptors and glassmakers and jewelers and graphic designers, and we would all hang out with each other. The discipline that you were in wasn't so important. It was more about the way that you made things, what the culture of making that you brought to your work. And I've tried to instill that in the office, even as it's grown and the projects have grown. Another thing which you can't really tell in this picture, but I can see, is that the variety of projects are all interspersed. There's not an area that's about housing. There's not an area that's about commercial buildings. There's not an area that's about education buildings. They all intertwine and influence each other. And the other thing is that our work is still in the design phases heavily reliant on the three-dimensional physical model. The office is in an area of the city called Silver Lake, which is a traditional part, an older part of the city that originally was populated by a lot of artists, a lot of architects, also a lot of people who were outside of the political mainstream. A lot of political movements started here. A number of expatriate European composers and musicians moved here. I was determined to start the office in this context, even though much of architecture culture in Los Angeles at the time was on the west side. That's where the schools were. That's where a lot of those well-known architecture names were. But I was fascinated by the fact that you were surrounded by this long tradition of architectural history, going back to people like Richard Neutra, Rudolf Schindler, Gregory Ains. Cooperative housing is right up the street from our office. LA also often has the rap that there's no history in the city, but that's not true. In fact, there's this incredibly long history of the evolution of inventive work in the city. Coming out of art school and moving to Silver Lake, I was surrounded by many of my friends who were not architects, but in fact were artists. Many of them who have gone on to incredibly influential careers of their own. It was a wide range of artists, all trying to figure out their position in art and their cultural influences. It was widely varied group of people, but we all hung out together. And that the influence and the conversations that were happening in and amongst my friends in the art world were probably as influential and maybe even more influential in much of the way that I thought about approaching architecture. Probably because of that relationship to art, our first ground up project was a house for two collectors, Alan Hergott and Kurt Shepard, which is a house just on the edge of Beverly Hills on a hill. It was a very small site that the house was almost going to completely occupy. But the program for the house was one of domesticity in some ways, but really the house was meant to be a gallery. The owners were very involved in the art world in Los Angeles. They were buying many of the same artists who were friends of mine for their collection. And they wanted a house that that worked in a very public way. The idea always with this house was that, yes, they would live there, but the accessibility to the art world was an important part of the program. In a sense, it was a kind of small private gallery or small private museum. It was an incredibly important project because it was a ground up project, and because the artists that they were collecting were growing in international stature, which meant that many of the people who came to see the gallery were part of that international art world. And so in a sense, I thought the architecture was successful, but what was almost more important was the fact that the artists attracted a kind of community that continued to be very, very important to my work. That house was included in Terry Riley's Unprivate House show at MoMA. Of course, many of the houses, the OMA house, Rem's house, were hugely iconic houses. But the fact that that first house was in the context of these other houses, and really just in the context of the conversation around architecture was extremely meaningful to me. I had always thought that architecture was a way, I had always hoped that architecture was going to be a way to create a way to be a part of that larger cultural conversation in some form. And with that house and the Unprivate House show, it felt like it was beginning to happen some. Out of that time, we received a project to do a building called MoMA QNS, MoMA Queens. MoMA, the main MoMA, the mothership, was undergoing major renovation. The Taniguchi renovation, Taniguchi additions were happening, and the museum couldn't continue to operate in Midtown Manhattan. And they bought a building in Queens that was an old stapler factory that they were going to convert into permanent storage. But in the meantime, they decided that they would run the programming there and use them as galleries. And they looked for a younger architect to give an opportunity to develop this project, and we got that commission. It was an unbelievable opportunity as well, highly visible because, again, of the MoMA name. I was interested though in the way that the building could have a kind of directness, both in its form, its industrial form, but in the way that the graphics, for instance, the signage on the roof would communicate to people going by on the elevated train, because that felt like it was attached to some of the original aspirations of the Museum of Modern Art. This idea when it started that it was, as Alfred Barr said, the original director, a speeding bullet moving through time and culture and space. I felt that that idea of the dynamic and procession and movement needed to be communicated somehow in the architecture at this point. The interior, all of the things that we made were going to be temporary. That was also a part of a sense of time and movement. The lobby was not a traditional lobby that you came and stood in, but was really one that you moved in a series of unfolding or unspooling narratives through. You really discovered through movement the procession in the museum. MoMA, because it was MoMA, because it was New York, though, was larger. I knew it was going to be a big thing for me and in the office. But I didn't realize the magnitude of it. These are some early images. There were lines around the block for weeks and weeks and weeks after it opened. The celebration to open the museum was a procession from Midtown Manhattan all the way across the bridge to Queens, including this fireworks bridge that was a big part of the opening. It was a pivotal moment for me, and one that, in a sense, created a real moment where I felt a deep sense of anxiety and worry, because there was no way after MoMA of continuing to try to develop my work and get it to a point that I felt like it was ready to be more visible, that I felt confident enough about it. There was no way for that to happen when after MoMA was open, because my career, this project created extraordinary visibility, which seems like a very lucky thing, and it seems peculiar to be worried about that. But I think it's challenging. What I found was that it was incredibly challenging as a young architect to have that much exposure at such an early point in my career. And I think about this as media has only become more and more prolific, and social media has become more and more extensive, and the architectural image has become more and more immediate, that for any young architect, the ability to spend some time crafting your work and developing a voice in some anonymity before you get to the point of feeling very confident about it is probably an ability that we no longer have. And I think that's going to continue to evolve and play out in architecture in interesting ways that will be useful to continue to observe. From that period, as I mentioned, the office's career accelerated significantly. Because we were doing museums, because we were involved in the art world, all of a sudden we had a number of art projects. Sonoma Museum of Art on the left, addition to the Vancouver Art Gallery, new museum in the middle of California, the Central Valley, the Fresno Museum of Art. I felt, again, hugely fortunate, but right at this time, 9/11 happened, and the economy completely stalled out. The office had grown very large. All of a sudden, there were many people in the office. We had all of this work, but all of the work was in one type of work. It was all cultural arts-related work, and all of the fundraising for that kind of work globally, but certainly in the US, stopped almost immediately. It seemed like we came in on a Monday morning and all of a sudden all of the work was put on hold by the clients. And I went from a practice that was growing and there were many people in the office to one in which we literally had no work overnight. And it was a very, very difficult and very hard series of lessons to see what you had started to grow change overnight, and to have to start finding a way to to rebuild that. That took a while, but during that time, we also were invited as an office to be a small member of a much larger team to make a proposal for the rebuilding of Ground Zero in New York City, the project that Daniel Libeskind eventually won. We were on a team with Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. They were the leaders. It was an incredible team. Sejiman Nishizawa, Neutlings Reduk, Stan Allen, field operations, Tom Leader studio were all a part of that project. Our team, in a sense, was almost too large. It was unwieldy. We made a scheme that I still to this day think is quite interesting. Really a type of density that you would rarely see in a city like even New York, which we think of as a very dense city. But probably more importantly, what that failed project taught me was that I learned a great deal about how projects at a very civic scale, how much the politics and the economies of this project have how influential they are on how a project moves forward for any larger project. And while it was a small glimpse into that, it became important later on as some of our projects became more civic scaled. The other thing I just want to mention from that time is that those projects that all stopped and none of them got built, they all fell away, still were extremely important. This is a model for the Fresno Museum that I mentioned. And these models still exist in the office, not as tombstones for dead projects, but because the ideas still exist in these models. They still exist in the projects. And I think that that's important when we look at the full range and body of an office. It's not just the projects that are completed, but it's that line and narrative of ideas that run all the way through the projects, both built and unbuilt. Following that period, one of the things that I recognized was that while much of my heart and my background was involved in the arts, that it was important for the work to diversify into other project types from a really a business standpoint, that to survive, the sustainability of the office meant that I really felt like we had to be careful that we weren't only doing work in one sector of the cultural economy. So that diversity was something that I began to concentrate on even more so. But along with that was the idea that diversity of work also needed to start to take on some of the original ambitions when I started the practice at the very, very beginning. And that was for architecture to have an influence in the widest range of projects possible. Of course, some of that work continued to be arts-related projects, including work like Regan Projects, which is a very influential gallery in Los Angeles, in an area of the city just outside of the Hollywood area, which is now developing again, is really an emerging part of the city. And art is a big part of that. The project we recently completed, the Winnipeg Art Gallery's Inuit Art Center, which is a new addition. Well, it's an addition to an existing building, which you see in the right. Ours is the lighter stone building with the more curvilinear facade in the immediate foreground. It houses the largest institutional collection of Indigenous art in Canada. And it's become a centerpiece, not only in Winnipeg as a cultural destination, but a real point of reconciliation, a real place of reconciliation for a wide cultural diaspora of Inuit Indigenous peoples in Canada. So in a sense has become almost a kind of national museum for Canada around these issues. Interestingly, in the background, just to the left with the range of square windows, we were asked by the university, which is a different, which is adjacent to the art gallery, the art museum, to do a new housing project. We built this, just recently finished, this mixed economy, mixed income apartment building that has both individuals from outside the university as well as students. And it's an unusual thing to build two projects for different clients in that proximity that have two completely different functions in the city, but are both have an ambition of helping to evolve this part of Winnipeg as it grows. The Moody Art Center, which is a project at Rice University, a multidisciplinary arts and cultural institution, with the goal of making an institution that brings together disciplines across the range of pedagogical programs at Rice. So for instance, a science professor or an engineering professor will collaborate with an artist, and that work can be made at Moody. There is a whole range of different types of spaces that include display, performance, as well as both analog and digital shops. An important part of our work, though, has been going back to the Skid Row area and finding ways for architecture to again be present in parts of the city, parts of Los Angeles, where architecture is generally not expected. We have been working now since the mid-2000s with a nonprofit housing developer called Skid Row Housing Trust, doing a series of buildings in Skid Row and now increasingly outside of the city for formerly homeless individuals. These projects are really meant to, of course, help those individuals find a supportive context to re-evolve their lives, re-emerge back into a more genuine civic and public and social life in the city. But these projects also are seen by the Trust as being urban catalysts as well. If not catalysts, at least trying to substantiate parts of the city in areas where there's a high transient population. We've found that these projects have the ability to have a great deal of invention. Star Apartments, which was the third of the projects that we completed with the Trust, is the first multifamily prefab project prefabricated project in Los Angeles. The Carver Apartments, which was the second project actually we completed with the Trust, which sits right next to the I-10 freeway that connects Santa Monica all the way across California, actually eventually ends up in Florida. But in this project, the goal was to, through its proximity to the highway, as a kind of front or Main Street in the city create a stronger visual relationship for this community that often lives anonymously in the city, to bring that community out of the shadows and try to make a stronger connection, even if it's just with the cars passing by. The fourth of our projects is the Crest Apartments in the San Fernando Valley, which is outside of the urban core of the city, trying to find ways to reach homelessness wherever it exists in the city. And in Los Angeles, it exists, unfortunately, everywhere. This is a highly performative, extremely sustainable project in Los Angeles and in this part of the valley. And maybe the first time we've been able to evolve the typology of these projects into something that I feel like is truly repeatable. And then a project we're working on currently, the Alvidres, which would be the tallest of the projects that we've done with the Housing Trust. It'll be the first mass timber project in Los Angeles. And we've been negotiating with the business or the building department to create a pathway for mass timber in Los Angeles, where it really, it hasn't been allowed from a code standpoint until this time. I wanted to finish up with just a couple of projects because I think that they're important in terms of some of the themes that I've tried to touch on that were very important in the beginning of my practice. Building in places, using architecture as a catalyst in parts of the city where architecture often doesn't exist, to think of architecture as a uniquely urban discipline, and to challenge some of the scales and typologies in the city through new forms. The first of the two I wanted to talk about is a Project One Santa Fe, which was completed a few years ago. Interestingly, sits right adjacent to Southern California Institute of Architecture, which of course many architects know, but it's adjacent to the Los Angeles River and a number of rail lines. It's really a site that was defined by the infrastructure that has grown up there over time. It's also a project that takes on the idea of scale and large scale as a real quality, I believe. Here I was trying to look at architecture because of its scale as blurring the distinction between a kind of urban design and architecture. At times, certainly you can see it as almost a discernible object, and at other times the building is at such a scale that it becomes almost an entire street front. Within that that enormous scale, the goal was to create a series of more particular and localized moments, giving the architecture its personality and its form, each of those moments starting to relate to specific contextual moments that are adjacent to the building. And then finally, a project that is ongoing and will be completed around this time, actually the summer of next year, 2022. And it's the Sixth Street Viaduct. There are a number of bridges that were built in the teens, in the 1920s, and the 1930s across the river in Los Angeles. The Sixth Street Viaduct was the longest of those, built in the 1930s. Because of the way that the concrete was composed when it was first built, the project almost from the beginning had deep structural problems and eventually had to be taken down because it was so seismically deficient. The new Sixth Street Viaduct would replace that. It was meant to be, well, the project was a competition. Each team with an architect and a large infrastructural design or engineering lead. We were fortunate to win the project with HNTB. the engineers, and Hargraves Associates, Hargraves Jones, the landscape architects for the project. This is a project that tries to reimagine infrastructure as a positive, taking on multiple responsibilities to tie and knit a portion of the city together in a city that has been largely defined by infrastructure, but whose infrastructure has done more to divide parts of the city than it has to connect the city. Of course, the program was to reestablish a car connection across from one side of the city to another. But we saw this project as being able to have many other types to anticipate other types of connections, bicycles, pedestrians, to grow an entire park space for a community that is very park poor underneath the bridge, to create greater access to the river, which is increasingly becoming an amenity, being reconstituted from when it was channelized and largely became just a storm drain in the city. All of those goals are looking to really use architecture in a way that architecture often isn't present in the infrastructural conversation. This was an opportunity to use many of the techniques and ideas of architecture with architecture's understanding of how to tie very disparate goals and ambitions and responsibilities in the city together. The bridge will have a series of these walkways. The park underneath is, as I mentioned, meant to be a kind of civic space, but ultimately it's not a bridge, or it's not a piece of infrastructure that is mono directional in its ambitions, but is a kind of multiculture. And going back to the idea of the riots in '92, giving or making it very clear that the city really wasn't a multiculture, that it had been a monoculture, or a city of singular cultures distinct from each other. The goal of this bridge is nothing less than trying to knit those separations back together again, or at least demonstrate the idea that those connections are in fact possible. This is just an image. Actually, the bridge is even much farther along than this, but I like this image because it speaks to the collapsing of those largely separated cultures and communities in the city that I spoke about earlier. Thank you very much again for inviting me, and I'd be glad to take any questions.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for the talk. Actually, some of the stories and some of the images I also see and hear the first time. I'm gonna invite Rex and Anderson to join us now for the conversation, and also invite our audience and attendees to submit questions or any comments you have through the chat box and Q&A box. Rex.
I think Rex, unfortunately, he texts everyone. He has to run off to another meeting.
Okay.
Because this is the way I see it is great, since you're speaking to us from Los Angeles, which is nighttime for your time. For us, it's around lunchtime. This is a very aptly, very brown bag series, I call it, right? Which brings back to the, when we are young and full of energy, you grab a sandwich and then anything for architecture, right? So a lot of the young architects actually join us today in this webinar. Indeed, thank you so much, Michael, for sharing all this great work. When I look at this almost deserves in and of itself just a lecture to talk about the buildings in more details, what you have designed and worked on in the past number of years that you've been practicing.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'd like to just bring back a little bit, since after all, this is called the first project. So it brings back to what I like to ask, because there are tons of questions from the panel. So I'm not going to take up more of their time, because this is more important for them to interact with you. So just one thing, because of all these great things, besides learning from the cities as a context, which you kind of dive into Los Angeles with all this new adventure, not dissimilar to a lot of the young architects these days. There's this great Bay Area for the young architects in Hong Kong to be submerging themselves into. So besides the city itself, what are the things that you learned from your first project in architecture that still benefits you today when you encounter new projects? What are the few tricks or few things that you think, oh, it brings you back to, this is the first project that I learned, the do's and don'ts. If you have that kind of magic wand to share with the young architects in the audience, that'd be wonderful as a starter.
You know, some of the things that I learned, and I think I do still come back to, is number one, it's very difficult when you're starting out to be able to edit all of the different voices and different responsibilities that you have as a young architect, to try to get a handle on all of the things that are coming at you as you're trying to make a project. And I think it's important to try to find ways to stay true to yourself, to listen to your intuition and believe it, and believe in your ambitions, number one, because those are the things that will continue to guide you, especially as projects get difficult. The second part of that is to find ways to be able to communicate that in a genuine and authentic way. I think often we feel as young architects that we have to convince the client. Somehow we have to forcefully make them believe in what we think is important. And if we can do that, if we can convince them through our words, somehow we'll get to do what we think is important. But I think it's clients, they're very smart. They know deep down what it is that they're trying to accomplish. Maybe not in form, but in terms of the basic ambitions for the project. I think it's important as a young architect to be able to listen to them and to be able to genuinely talk about what you're honestly trying to do without trying to market the project to them. Because it's in that genuine conversation that you build up trust, because they understand that you're speaking with them honestly. And while you may not be able to get exactly the things you were trying to get in exactly that way, I'm convinced that that dialogue over the course of a project evolves into something that does actually match your ambitions, does match your ideas, and also is something that can be made, which is ultimately the goal. I think another thing that I think a great deal about is, and I think I still deal with this, is that you can't force a design for yourself. You know, at times you have a deadline, and well, you always have a deadline, but you have real pressures on the project. And as a young architect, you have a lot of ambitions for the project, especially your first projects. It has to be great because it's going to represent who you are to the world. And I think at times we force that to such an extent that the projects become more contorted, more difficult, and less articulate. I've learned over the years that there's a certain amount of both pressure you have to put on yourself, but also a lot of space that you need to give yourself in the creative process. It will come. And it's very difficult to believe that when you're younger, because you don't have as many experiences probably of facing that wall and then realizing you actually do get to the other side. But getting that balance between, of course, trying to continue to push on the project, but believing in yourself that the idea will arrive is, I think you never stop trying to work through that.
Great, wonderful. Yeah, I think we have quite a number of questions. Maybe Sue can
Yes.
read those.
So probably start from question from Shirley Chan. First question, no brainer. Are you partial to white buildings?
I am. I could just stop there, but I am, although of course we do make some other work that whose color is not white. I became interested in the way, in the beginning, it was a lot about using a material. I had, for instance, Inner City Arts project that the budgets were minuscule. They were tiny. I was trying to do everything I could to make a building with very, very little means. And so I was using the kinds of materials that were ubiquitous in the cheapest building culture in Los Angeles. And that was wood frame with stucco plaster exterior. And there's this long tradition in Los Angeles of architecture and mission style work that uses that same material. And I loved how fluid and how plastic the stucco was. And I loved the whiteness of the color, because it really reacted to the color of the environment around it. In a sense, it was a kind of neutral canvas, if you will, that seemed to take on the influences of the color from what was around it. I think about color and I think about light a great deal. I think of color as a material in our work. I learned that partially because of the Museum of Modern Art project, the MoMA Queens project, which you saw had a very, much of the facade was blue. When we got that existing building to redo, it was clad in a very light blue brick, but because it needed to be climate controlled, heavily climate controlled, the brick was too leaky and it had to be skinned with this cheap EVIS material. But everybody in that neighborhood knew it as the blue building, and I didn't want to lose that connection. So I picked a blue that was more vibrant, that I thought was more spirited. And we sent 3 samples of the color, 3 different, slightly different shades to New York, and they painted big test panels on it. And I flew to New York to see it, and I got out of the car and I realized all 3 of the colors were completely wrong. And the reason they were wrong was that I had chosen the blue in a Los Angeles light, but the New York light was completely different. It had a different hue, it had different warmth, it had a different density to the color. We eventually picked the colors that were right for that place, but told me a lot about how color and surface is actually has a contextual component to it as well. And so white continues to be something I'm very interested in. It never seems to stop fascinating me in terms of how it reacts to what's around it, but also the kinds of forms that you can make with it.
I guess it also relates to like what you described in the beginning, you know, talk like the limited resources you have when you first started, and you have to think about this issue of the economy of means and reusing materials, reusing fragments of buildings, elements of buildings, and even using graphic and color as part of the materials for the project. And that's and that eventually leads to, you can see some of the project you have later on, even with a larger scale.
That's right. And I think some of that came from my background, my education in the arts, going to art school and seeing my friends who were artists making things out of almost anything. There wasn't necessarily a traditional or an accepted palette of materials to make a piece from. And I really believe that in architecture, that if we circumscribe our work to just a palette of accepted materials that architecture is supposed to use, especially in the commercial space, it makes it more difficult to do things like create more inventive form with an economy of means. I think that's something that you can certainly do as a young architect, is to try to find ways, no matter what, to build your ideas and to not be so dependent in believing that the cultural values that we put on certain materials, to not be so beholden to that. You know, we often think of there are fancy materials and really junky materials. That's kind of a coarse way to put it. And if we make a building out of the fancy materials, then the building must be a good building. But you can walk around any city and see the worst architecture you've ever come across, where they spent a lot of material, a lot of money on great materials, but the work is of very little consequence. I think the opposite can be true as well, that you can make work of great consequence with very few means, but it means you have to bring your architectural intelligence to that game.
And there's a question. Thank you for the honest presentation about your career path. In your engagement with young art graduates today, do you see a shift of interest away from the embodied experience of architecture and towards the image as exacerbated by social media, where everything is reduced to flat and beautified images, as opposed to a total and phenomenological experience, or nothing has changed in your observation?
I think this is a very, certainly a very interesting and very challenging time for young architects, young practitioners. I think it's a very challenging time for a younger generation in society as a whole, because of how complex the world has become in the last number of years, and the realities that we're facing in terms of inequality and accessibility, and obviously the pandemic. I feel like, at least in the younger people in my office and the people that I work with in schools when I'm on reviews or teaching some, that there's a split right now. There is one avenue which some people seem to be on, which is really about the making of work and the imaging of that work, and how the work becomes a part of that larger social and media conversation. I also see a generation that has a great commitment to fundamental cultural and social values, and who are trying to make work that pushes in a more progressive way some of those values, not necessarily by making work or making architecture, but through their actions, becoming more involved in politics, in social organizations, in the city as a whole. I don't know that architecture should ever allow itself to be one or the other. I think both of those worlds are important in architecture. For instance, there's been a lot of conversation around the work over the last 15 or 20, 25 years in architecture, and the kind of star architect culture that was created in society around those buildings. And there's been a lot of pushback against some of those buildings. But I think we have to be cautious in architecture, because the ability to make work that is extremely visible and provocative and present in the city, for instance, is one of our tools, and can be used for great good. In the Carver Apartments, the round building next to the highway, it's an unusually shaped building that has a strong aesthetic presence in the city, and that was purposeful. It was a goal of the client and of ourselves to make a building for a community that has largely, as I mentioned, been anonymous, to make a building that was very present in the city, that was undeniable. And the way to do that was through architectural form and its aesthetics, even though the form and the aesthetics were being used as tools for really a social purpose. At the same time, that activism, the activist architect, the using our capabilities to understand complex situations, to work with different communities and political leaders, to try to change the dynamic in cities by action that's not classically architecture. That's an enormous quality that architects have, ability that architects have as well. The question is going to be how to, I think, find a way eventually to bring all of those tools back together again. Because the challenges that we're facing aren't going away anytime soon. We're going to need the best set of tools we have.
Thank you. This time is limited. I'm going to combine some of the questions. So there are two questions related to two types of buildings. One is about prefab units. The skilled housing build project with the prefab units on top of the podium looks like a prototype that could be replicated in other locations. What are the lessons learned from that project, and will the model be replicated in other cities? And the other one is about adaptive reuse. How do you see this new affinity to the old and local, and how in the context of LA with something very unique in the city and existing urban fabric, how do you see your office or practice could continue that kind of project?
It's something that we continue to look at in a number of projects in the city. This idea of adaptive reuse or reusing parts of the city. Los Angeles has generally been thought of as a teardown city. Most times when a new development is happening, the site gets purchased and anything that's on it gets completely scraped clean and a new building gets put on top of it. But I think that's for many reasons, a fundamentally problematic way of going about working in a city. I think it's important from a sustainability standpoint, from a historic standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, to try to find ways to not constantly wipe the slate clean, but to try to find ways to build almost in a layered or palimpsest-like way in the city. And with Star Apartments, one of the goals, besides the prefabrication, was to reuse that existing building at the base of the apartments. It's reclad. We put a new facade on it, but all of the building itself, all of the structure that was there, we preserved, which is a much more economical and sustainable way of reusing something. In a lot of ways, the prefabrication technique came from the fact that we were reusing this existing building, and we had to find a way to then build very quickly on top of that existing building, because you couldn't stage the construction from any place else, and they couldn't close the street for long periods of time. So we were trying to find a way to literally accelerate the construction, and prefabrication became a way to think about doing that. Then it became more complicated to work with the city to figure out how to actually permit it, because they didn't have an idea of how to do that. I do think it's a replicable model. It's probably one of the challenges that we've found with prefabrication. There are a couple of challenges. One is that the pool of contractors in the city don't really know how to do prefabrication. It's a very unusual thing for them, because it means when you do a project like Star Apartments, the majority of the building is built by a different contractor, a prefabrication contractor, off-site, and it all gets trucked to the site, and then it gets placed. It means that the general contractor really doesn't actually build very much, and they don't know how to deal with that. So there's a learning curve there. The second thing is that prefabrication is like making products, like a car. The economy is in doing a lot of them. If you do 4 prefabricated units, it's going to be more expensive than if you built it just using conventional means. And what we found was at Star Apartments, through Star Apartments, the cutoff was about 85 units. You had to have more than 85 units, more or less, to make it economical. So one of the challenges is just finding the bigger the project to do it, the better. And that's going to continue to take changes on the part of the developer community to move from techniques they know and scales they know to new techniques and scales. That's starting to happen now, but it's taken 7 or 8 years.
Okay. I want to just ask one last question before we close this. So for someone like you, an architect with all this experience and achievements, do you still anticipate any, say, new project or first project, new adventures to come? Besides, hopefully you can visit Hong Kong for the first time very soon. You know?
That's right. Well, that would be that's high on my list. That would be fantastic. And Anderson mentioned a longer lecture about buildings at some point, and maybe it'd be great to be able to be there in person at some point. I do continue to look for those. I think you have to look for them. You have to challenge yourself to look for those new challenges, those new building types, to try to do things you haven't done before. And that is some work, because as an office grows and it becomes more mature and more established, the pressure on the office is to do the same thing you've done before, because that's how you make the most money. That's the most efficient way to do it. But if you go down that path, you slowly move away from doing things that challenge you, that scare you, that make you rethink how you would approach a project. And those are my favorite projects, the ones that we haven't done yet, that I don't really know when we start how to do the project. I feel confident that we'll get there, but that I'm not completely sure how to even start that. And I think when that ends, that's the time to call the career quits. But until that happens, and it doesn't seem to be, I don't feel like I've figured it out yet. So it's the thing that keeps you going.
Right. Thank you, Michael, for joining us, for staying late for us. I'm sure like we will be like thinking about all these things, like for like discussing about them, like, and for the next couple like talks in this series as well. But thank you so much for joining us.
All right, well, thank you for having me. Congratulations on a great series. It seems like you've really invented something here. It's pretty terrific what you've put together. I appreciate being invited. It was fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay.
Have a good evening.
All right.